Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Abralim ao Vivo, Linguistics Online. This event is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association, Abralim, in cooperation with a number of other scientific societies, such as Comitê Internacional Permanente de Linguistas, Associação de Linguística e Filologia da América Latina, Sociedade Argentina de Estudos Linguísticos, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, and the Australian Linguistic Society. So my name is Diogo Pinheiro. I work at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, UFRJ, and now I have the honor and the privilege to introduce Professor Dirkn Geeraerts, who is a professor of linguistics at the University of Leuven and the head of the research group Quantitative, Lexical, and Variational Linguistics. So as many of you know, Professor Geeraerts has been for many years now a leading figure in the development of the cognitive linguistics enterprise, if you wish. And his own work, focused mainly on lexical semantics and lexicology, has helped not only shape the field, but also push its boundaries towards a more socially oriented type of investigation. And in fact, his work has been critical to the emergence of the relatively recent field of cognitive sociolinguistics. In his own research aside, he also played an important role in the institutionalization and international expansion of cognitive linguistics. And then when I say that, what I have in mind is his work as a founding editor of the journal Cognitive Linguistics, as a former president of the International Cognitive Linguistics Association, and as the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Cognitive Linguistics. So he's done a lot, and right now he's just ready to start talking about word meaning research, its scope and development. So I guess I'll just stop talking and let us welcome Professor Dirkn Geeraerts. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be part of this very fine initiative. It's really the kind of thing that we need in these difficult times. What I would want to talk about in this talk is precisely the topic that Diogo has also has already introduced, namely lexical semantics, word meaning research. And what I would like to do is to basically to give an overview of the development of lexical semantics in, well, let's say the past 130 years. So it's a pretty wide scope that I have, and in that sense, it is a bit of an introductory talk in which I want to basically focus on three topics, three dimensions of lexical semantics. First, the theoretical development, then the descriptive development, and then something about methodology. Theoretical development, what I would like to show is that in the development of word meaning research, we can see a succession of competing currents. And obviously, you've heard that I've been involved and I'm still involved in cognitive linguistics and cognitive semantics. So I will pay some special attention to the position of cognitive semantics in this field of competing theoretical frameworks. Then with regard to the descriptive development of lexical semantics, I'll try to show that in the course of those 150 years, you get actually a broadening of the empirical scope. The kind of phenomena, the spectrum of phenomena that word meaning research deals with is really expanding. And I will try to indicate how each of the various traditions, theoretical traditions, actually contributes to the broadening of the empirical scope of the field. And then in terms of method, I will pay some special attention to the recent rise of corpus linguistic semantic research. And if there's sufficient time left, I will I will say something about the type of research that we are currently doing in our research group. Before getting down to business, I would perhaps also want to say something about the motivation that you may have for getting into lexical semantic research. And I'd like to, and also for giving this overview talk, if you wish. There are 2 points that I want to refer to. One is that meaning is central in linguistics, or at least it should be. And I firmly believe that the lexicon, studying the lexicon, is central for understanding how linguistic meaning works. If you think of all the linguistic expressions and linguistic constructions that we have as meaningful categories, and that's of course the tendency that we've seen emerging in the last 20, 30 years. So if you think of any linguistic expression as in some sense meaningful, then what we know about lexical meaning and lexical categorization might very well be useful for the semantic description of other types of linguistic expressions. One other way of saying this would be to say that, well, most of linguistic meaning resides in the lexicon. So we should perhaps pay a little bit more attention to the lexicon than contemporary traditions often do. And specifically, the traditions that came or that became prominent in the second half of the 20th century, all types of formal syntactic approaches, are less inclined to study the lexicon than is useful when you're interested in meaning. So that's one reason for paying sufficient attention, and a bit more than usual, to lexical research. That's one thing. The other thing is that precisely also as a result of this predominant focus on syntax that we've had in specifically in the second half of the 20th century, because of this focus, lexical semantics is not so very well represented in mainstream introductions to linguistics. What you find in textbooks is usually rather fragmentary. And as a result, linguists as they are conventionally trained, are mostly familiar with only a restricted number of approaches in lexical semantics. So one of the messages, if you wish, that I want to convey today is that there is quite a broad field of study in lexical semantics, and the talk, in a sense, is intended to give you, if you wish, a kind of map of the things that you can do in lexical research. One more piece of background. What I will be saying here is to a large extent also present in this book I published 10 years ago, Theories of Lexical Semantics. What I'm presenting today is more simplified than what you can find in the text in the book. But if you want to know more about what I'm presenting today, then this would be the first reference, I would say. Okay, so let me now first get into the theoretical dimension. So this overview of the different currents, theoretical currents that we've had in those 150 years. And I'm going to do that by distinguishing four traditions, four major lines of research. Briefly, I'll start off with pre-structuralist diachronic semantics. Then I'll say something about structuralist and neo-structuralist semantics. Then about generativist and neo-generativist semantics, and then I'm coming to cognitive semantics. Yes, pre-structuralist semantics. This is in contrast with a theory like structuralist semantics, which is known as such by that name, pre-structuralist semantics is not a name that we usually use, but it is clearly, if you think of the development of lexical semantics, it is clearly a tradition that is dominant from at least 1870. Actually, you could go back a bit further, but that's not so important, which is dominant from 1870 to at least 1930. And what do I mean by saying that it is dominant? Well, that means that most of the research that the lexical semantic research that is being done at that time is precisely situated in this framework. And it is a framework with a specific number of characteristics of its own. I'm coming to that in a moment. If you think about the people involved, the important authors, well, those would be people like Hermann Paul and Michel Breal. Those two are actually very important. Other people like Darmesteter, Neurup, Wundt, Stern. There's a whole range. And the basic research activity, the basic descriptive and theoretical activity that these people bring to the field is that essentially they are presenting classifications of the mechanisms of meaning change. So the main focus of attention there is how meaning changes. And that means in practice that they deal with mechanisms like metaphorical changes, metonymical changes, and a whole range of other phenomena. And most of the discussion in these days is exactly about the question, what would be the best way of classifying the mechanisms that lead to changes in word meaning? So if we characterize that in a slightly more theoretical, more abstract way, then there are three important characteristics of the approach of this pre-structuralist diachronic approach. First, it has this historical or diachronic orientation. The main phenomena in meaning is meaning change. Second, it has a semasiological orientation, coming to that in a moment, and it has what I will call, for lack of a better term, a conceptual orientation. So let's see historical orientation. So that's obviously a focus on diachronic variability of meaning, mechanisms of semantic change. It's a semasiological approach because it has a focus on single words and the development of those words. Now here I have to introduce a very important terminology, which is not so well known in certain traditions of research, but which is very important for lexical research, and actually I would say for any type of meaning research. And that's the distinction between a semasiological and an onomasiological approach. So you can think about it in this way. Semasiology is looking from the concept, or let's say from the form to the meaning. And onomasiology is looking from the meaning to the word. With a quote from Kurt Baldinger, structuralist semantician, you can get the distinction between the two approaches in the following way. Semasiology considers the isolated word and the way its meanings are manifested, while onomasiology looks at the designations of a particular concept. So to make it even more clear, if you have a semasiological perspective, you will basically be interested in polysemy. Polysemy is one word or one expression having different meanings. You start from the word, look at the meanings. Onomasiology, you look the other way around. You have a given meaning and you try to see what the expressions are, what the relevant words are. So that would lead, for instance, as a counterpart to polysemy, to the study of something like synonymy. I'm emphasizing this distinction because it's important to see the differences in orientation of various stages in this development of lexical semantics. And then the third feature is that this pre-structuralist tradition has a conceptual orientation, by which I mean that there is a focus on meaning as an expression of an individual or a culture. It's less a focus on meaning as something that is inherently linguistic. The meaning is something that resides in a culture or in a person's experience. Again, that's also going to be a fairly important difference of perspective in the further evolution of the field. Okay, let's represent this graphically. Okay, this doesn't mean a lot, but you will see that I will gradually develop a tree, if you wish, with the evolution and the relationship of the various approaches. So what is the next step? The next step is structuralist semantics. And that's the type of semantics that came into being in the wake or in the context of structuralism as a linguistic approach in general. And of course, we think of Ferdinand de Saussure as the founding father of a structuralist approach. It's a perspective of lexical semantics that was dominant from, let's say, 1930 to 1965. And important names here would be people like Trier, Weisgerber, Hilmsley, Geeraerts, Potier, Lyons, and many others. What they are interested in is not things like metaphor and metonymy, the focus of the previous tradition, but phenomena like lexical fields and taxonomies, lexical relations, componential analysis. Let me say a bit more about these things. Lexical fields are obviously, that's a concept that most people will be familiar with. Items that are words that are related because they have a similar meaning. All words having to do with cooking, for instance. Taxonomies are hierarchically structured fields, like when you have the animal kingdom, and then within the animal kingdom you have fish, and then you have types of fish like salmon, and then you have specific types of salmon. So you have layers of specificity. Lexical relations, that's things like synonymy. Synonymy is a specific relationship between two words. And then componential analysis, that's an approach in which you try to analyze and describe the relationship between different words by breaking down the meaning of those words. So if you want to describe the similarity and the distinction between terms like boy and girl, what you would do is to say, okay, these are human beings, that's one feature. They are young human beings, that's another feature. They share those two features, but there's one feature that is distinctive, and that's male versus female. So that's a componential analysis. So importantly, what you have in this approach is various forms of a structural description of the lexicon. And it is structural precisely because the focus lies on the relationship between different items. In a lexical field, you have different words together because they are semantically similar. In a componential analysis, you analyze how meaning components distinguish and relate words like boy and girl. So in general terms, the orientation, and this is now important, but now you can see how it differs from the previous approach. It's synchronic instead of diachronic. It's not so interested in historical change, but it's interested in meaning as a synchronic property of a linguistic system, where the linguistic system is a stable entity. It is, and here you see why I was emphasizing this terminological distinction, it is onomasiological because it looks at the linguistic system as a set of interrelated signs. So there's a focus on the structure of the vocabulary rather than on individual words. And it's system-oriented in the sense that it sees the linguistic system as pre-existent and dominant with regard to linguistic usage. That's again an important point for the further development, namely the relationship between system and usage. You need a system to use the language. So in a structuralist approach, you emphasize the system. And the system, of course, is also the stable thing. More recent approaches, as we will see, tend to pay more attention to the usage level, because it is also at the usage level where you will first see changes happening. And so structuralism is definitely a system-oriented approach. Then what happens next? Then, oh yes, almost forgot this. So structuralist semantics is also the theoretical model that is best represented in introductions to linguistics. And even given the various forms of structuralism that you have, you can even say that there is a focus on a lexical relations approach. So that's the approach focusing on relations like synonymy, paronymy, antonymy, and so on. But then the next step, oh yes, the representation. So we're now adding structuralist semantics, and I'm using a double arrow here precisely to emphasize the distinction, the theoretical switch, if you wish, that you get between the first stage and the second stage. Then we come to generativist semantics. That's a very short-lived approach, which played a role, intrinsically, you might say, a minor role from 1965 to 1980 with people like Katz and Beerwisch and Leach, even Macaulay, where the basic idea is that componential analysis, as we saw it in structuralist semantics, can be formalized, can be written down in a symbolical form, and can then be rated in a formal grammar. And of course, at that point, that's basically a generative grammar. As I said, this is an approach that existed only briefly. And its importance is, to a certain extent, very much internal to generative grammar and formal syntax, because it triggered a crucial debate in generative grammar about the position of meaning in a formal grammar. And that discussion which turned around the question, how much meaning do we need in a grammar? Well, in the generative tradition, that discussion was decided in favor of a minimal approach to meaning. So at that point, you might say that in this stage, between 1965 and a decade or so later, there was a clear possibility for merging the traditions of lexical semantics with the tradition of formal syntax. But then within formal syntax, the discussions turned the other way, and the debate about the position of meaning led to an emphasis on syntax as something formal and formalized and as autonomous. So all the meaning related phenomena that you get from, for instance, the cultural background of reading would be considered as irrelevant for autonomous syntax. And so at that point, formal syntax separated again, if you wish, from the study of lexical meaning. This is not this is too simplistic because obviously there has also been a growing tendency within syntax to consider the relationship between lexical meaning and formal phenomena. But the interest in lexical meaning per se was, if to put it that way, was subsumed under an interest in formal syntax. And what we can see happening further on in lexical semantics as such can now easily be situated against the background that we have now. So in that background, we now have these three approaches: pre-structuralist semantics, a reaction in structuralist semantics, and then a line that takes up ideas from structuralist semantics and introduces them in generativist semantics. Now, what is neo-structuralist semantics? Well, there I would, under that label, I would want to place a number of positions, a number of theories that take up concepts that were developed in structuralist semantics, but give them a new twist. So these are people like Igor Melchuk and Anna Wierzbicka, and also the WordNet approach, which is quite important in computational linguistics. What these people do is, as I say, they take existing ideas like lexical relations, but expand them, for instance. So in the case of Melchuk, what he would do is to introduce a number of lexical relations that are not usually, or that were not conventionally included in traditional structuralist semantics. So for instance, Melchuk has one lexical relation, figurative, and figurative is not the type of relationship that would go into the older positions. WordNet, what you have in the WordNet framework, is basically an extensive taxonomical description of a vocabulary, and that, as I already hinted at, is something that is very important in computational terms. So computational linguists use WordNet representations or WordNet information almost on a daily basis, you might say. And then the approach developed by Anna Wierzbicka, that's a new take on a componential analysis, because what she tries to do is to find a universal set of basic semantic components with which it would be possible to describe any type of meaning in any type of language. So overall, these are approaches that continue the structuralist tradition, but give it a specifically new perspective by expanding it in a specific way. So into the schema, it goes like that. Then in the same way in which we have neo-structuralist semantics, I also need to point to a neo-generativist approach, and that's basically the so-called generative lexicon approach developed by James Blaszczowski. And just like the neo-structuralist approaches continue the structuralist ideas, sorry, the generative lexicon approach continues a formal approach to lexical meaning. But then, and that's the very interesting addition there, with a specific concern for the dynamics of meaning, for meaning change and polysemy. But specifically, and that ties in obviously with the fact that this is an approach that links up, that still links up closely with a formal perspective on language. Those dynamic aspects of the lexicon, the development of new meanings, are seen from a rule-based point of view. They're seen as the result of applying certain rules for meaning extension. And those rules are very often also linked with specific syntactic features of the expressions that the words occur in. So there is an expansion here from, if you compare it to the original generativist ideas, there is an expansion towards more attention for the dynamics of meaning, but still the overall framework is still very much formal, formalizing, and very much linking up with a syntactic approach to linguistic expressions. And those are features that are less prominent in the final approach that I want to talk about, and that is then, of course, cognitive semantics, with people like Lakoff, Lanneker, Fillmore, Talmy, Fauconnier, and many others, where we get to concepts like prototypicality, conceptual metaphysics, frames, basic levels, and so on. I'm not going to introduce those at this point. I'll say something more about that in a moment. And what I want to say here is that this cognitive semantics approach is very much, or at least in some respects, a return to the position that we had in the pre-structuralist tradition. In what sense? Well, one thing is, and that is what distinguishes it from, for instance, the neo-generativist approaches, it's not so much interested in formalizing, in symbolically representing the language. It is very much interested in the flexibility and the dynamics of the language, synchronic flexibility. And just like I said, that this initial approach, the pre-structuralist approach, was a conceptually oriented one. In this case, you also get an interest in meaning as a form of cognition, but where cognition is experiential, is embodied. It's not meaning as just a feature of the language, but it's meaning as an aspect of the cognitive experience of people. So the terms that they use are, as I said, they talk about an experiential approach to meaning, an embodied approach to meaning. In general, you could say it's a contextualized approach to meaning. Meaning, lexical meaning, is seen as interacting with all the cognitive abilities of people, with their experience, with their cultural background, and so on. As I said, I'm coming to a few more detailed aspects of this in a moment, but let me first now complete the picture. So what we have, again, to recapitulate, we start with pre-structuralist semantics, then we get a reaction, we get an opposite approach, basically, in structuralist semantics, which is then to some extent incorporated in this short-lived tradition of generativist semantics. Structuralist semantics in a specific form lives on in a number of neo-structuralist approaches. Generative semantics is developed in a more dynamic way than it initially was in the neo-generativist approaches. And then cognitive semantics opposes this formalistic approach of generative semantics. And in that sense, but I didn't draw that line, in up to a point, links up again with the original pre-structuralist approaches. Now, if we, as a next step, if we want to identify underlying trends, then we have to point to a number of contrasts in these various traditions. So let me represent that graphically. One contrast is between approaches that use a formal system of representation, mostly linking up with a formal grammar, and approaches that are less concerned with formalization. So projecting that onto the chart, we get something like this. The generativist and the neo-generativist approaches are clearly very much interested in this formalizing approach. Then a second underlying trend is the contrast between approaches that describe vocabulary and lexical meanings in a sort of steady state, and approaches that emphasize the dynamics and the flexibility of meanings. So projecting that would bring together, on the one hand, pre-structuralist semantics, which is only about flexibility and change of meaning, and then cognitive semantics and neo-generative semantics as well, which have this specific interest in flexibility of meaning. And third, and I would say that I consider this to be the most important distinction, you have approaches that are system-oriented, that see meaning primarily as a feature, a characteristic of a linguistic system, as something stable, something more or less living on its own, and approaches that have a usage and experience-oriented perspective. And so that's, again, the link that brings together, or the perspective that brings together, cognitive semantics and pre-structuralist semantics. So if you look at it from this way, I'm now concluding the first part of what I wanted to say. If you look at it in this way, you can see that you have a wide spectrum of approaches with some very interesting underlying tensions, tensions that have to do with the role of formalization, the role of the system versus the usage of the system, and the synchronic versus dynamic, flexible perspective. If you look at it this way, sorry. If you look at it in this way, you might say that there is a difference of opinion. So that would be rather, well, it's not really conflict, but you do see that there are choices to be made. Now, on the other hand, if we go to I've said that, so if we go to the descriptive perspective, then we can actually see that those different traditions all contribute to the expansion of the field of lexical semantics. So from this point of view, from the descriptive point of view, so that's the second step I want to take, we can see that the different approaches actually, well, you could almost say, work together to expand the scope of lexical semantics. So how am I going to illustrate that, or to argue for that? Well, if we look at the long-term development of lexical semantics, we see this expansion of its scope, and we can describe that expansion in terms of three distinctions: a semasiological versus an onomasiological one. We've already talked about that. A diachronic versus a synchronic perspective. Again, we've talked about that. And then, and that's something new that I will have to explain, a qualitative versus a quantitative approach. Now, the first two, semasiology, onomasiology, diachrony, synchrony. What can we say about that? So the question, the underlying question here is, which traditions of the ones that we charted a moment ago, which traditions bring in a specific perspective? And bringing in that perspective is then expanding the scope of the descriptive scope of the approach. Well, as we've already seen, the addition of an onomasiological perspective and the shift towards a synchronic perspective, that's largely due to structuralist semantics. That's precisely how we could identify the specific position of structuralist semantics, going from the diachronic perspective of pre-structuralist approaches to a synchronic perspective, going from an emphasis on a single word to describing vocabularies as a whole. But what I want to add at this point is that there have actually also been quite a number of interesting approaches, interesting expansions of onomasiology within this tradition of cognitive semantics. So I went over the specific phenomena that cognitive semantics dealt with rather quickly. So this is the point where I want to say a bit more about them. So one of the very popular aspects of cognitive semantics is Lakoff's idea of conceptual metaphors. And if you think of conceptual metaphors in terms of the distinction between semasiology and onomasiology, then you can actually say that conceptual metaphors are fields of metaphorical expressions with the same underlying mapping between a source and a target domain. So to illustrate very well-known example, love is a journey. That's a conceptual metaphor. Then you have the specific expressions. Look how far we've come. We're at a crossroads. We'll just have to go our separate ways, and so on and so on. These are all individual metaphors, but the conceptual metaphor, the underlying theme that maps the field of a journey onto the field of love, that underlying theme is basically describing a semantic field of metaphorical expressions. So that's onomasiology. That's a field. Traditional lexical field theory does not deal with metaphors, just with literal expressions. What you can say then is that one contribution of cognitive semantics to onomasiology is this introduction of the notion of, well, conceptual, or let's say metaphorical lexical fields. A second contribution, the notion of frames as introduced by Fillmore. What are frames? Again, this is something that many of you may know. Frames are, again, sets of expressions that belong together, like in the well-known commercial transaction frame or scene, where you get expressions like buy, sell, buyer, seller, money, price, cost, and so on. And the point here is that these, what keeps those expressions together is not their metaphorical similarity, as in conceptual metaphor. It's not their literal similarity, as in a traditional lexical field approach, but it's basically their metonymical link. A metonymical link in the sense that within the scene of a commercial transaction, you have a buyer and a seller, and you have an act from the part of the buyer and an act on the part of the seller, and there is something that is being sold, and so on. On top of that, you get constructional equivalences, so that you can say Mary sold a book to John is the same as John bought a book from Mary, and so on. So again, from the point of view of the scope of lexical semantics, this is cognitive semantics contributing a specific type of onomasiological phenomenon, namely metonymically linked expressions, if you wish, metonymical semantic fields. Again, a third example in the form of taxonomies. We know about taxonomies, hierarchically structured fields. What more contemporary cognitive approaches add to that is the idea that some levels in natural taxonomies carry more weight than others. That's the basic level idea, which was first introduced by Berlin and Kay. So an example, if we again take the example of fish, then you have the different levels: animal, fish, freshwater fish, bass, black bass, large-mouthed black bass, all of them more and more specific. But in that taxonomy, there is a level that is the most common one to talk about fish. And that's where we would use precisely the word fish, or the more specific one, the next specific level, which is bass in this case. So the idea here is that within such a lexical structure, in this case a taxonomy, you need to take into account levels of importance. And some levels are more natural than others when it comes to talking about a field. You might say some are dominant with regard to others. There are various ways in which this dominance shows up, but that's not so important here. Let's say that this would be this intermediate, or these intermediate levels are the most natural, most spontaneous levels to talk about the elements of this taxonomy. So again, that's an expansion of onomasiology. We already knew about taxonomies, but the cognitive perspective adds the idea that there is a difference in weight within the taxonomies. Okay, so now once we have that, we can now also define what I meant by this distinction between quantitative and qualitative approaches. In what sense? Well, basic levels are typical for a quantitative shift in the scope of lexical semantics, in the sense that when you look quantitatively, what I mean is that you're not just interested in a question, what are the elements that occur, but you're also interested in the question, what is the importance of those elements within the structure? And a traditional approach would assume that all elements are equally important. But as we just saw in the case of basic levels, that doesn't have to be the case. If you take your taxonomical levels, some elements of that set of levels may be more important than others. And importantly, this applies both to the onomasiological perspective, like in taxonomies, but it also applies to the semasiological perspective. I'll explain in a moment. And second, and that's also quite important, once you start taking into account such a quantitative perspective, you basically also shift towards an approach that takes usage into account. If you look at the system, then you only have the different levels in the system. If you're saying one of those levels is more important, well, how do you know? Well, it's more important because it's used more. So the link with a usage-oriented approach is embodied in this addition of a quantitative perspective. So now to see how this applies systematically to semasiology and onomasiology in an onomasiological perspective. The quality question is, what are the semantic relations that hold between items like fields, taxonomies, lexical relations? And the quantitative question would be, are some of these categories cognitively more salient than others? And then you get to basic levels. Now, what would that mean on the semasiological side? Well, quality is involved with the question, which meanings does a word have? How are they semantically related? And then you study things like metaphor, metonymy, and so on. The quantitative question would be, do all those readings carry the same structural weight? Do they have the same status? And then you're going to study what is known as prototypicality effects of various kinds. To briefly illustrate, take a category like fruit. You have typicality effects, prototypicality effects, if you wish, in the sense that an apple is a more typical fruit than a mango, but this is very much culturally sensitive. This changes from culture to culture. I'm here talking from my perspective, which is not, for instance, the same as a Brazilian perspective. And there is demarcational fuzziness in the sense that you may, at least for some categories, you may have unclear boundaries. Do we actually consider a coconut as a fruit, or is it really a nut, or is it functionally speaking something in between a nut and a fruit? What about an avocado and so on. So you get demarcational fuzziness. This is a whole set of phenomena that belongs together under this label of prototypicality effects. The crucial thing here is that you should see that it is again emanating from a quantitative approach where you ask the question, are all the elements that we find in a category, are they equally important? So if we have all the types of fruit as members of the category fruit, are all those members equally important? Probably not. So if we then map that out, then we get a chart like this with semasiological approaches, onomasiological approaches, quantitative perspectives, qualitative perspectives. On the one hand, investigating structure. On the other hand, investigating difference of weights of the elements within those structures. So we get senses, links between senses, semantic relations among items, prototypicality as involving salience phenomena, and difference in cognitive salience between categories or categorial levels. That's the overall scope, if you wish, of the phenomena that would go into lexical semantics. But the point I'm now trying to make is that we, if we take this overview and then map again the different traditions onto it, then we can actually see how the theoretical evolution of lexical semantics has led to this expansion of the field and actually to the filling out of a field that you could describe, or that you can describe in this way. So if we chart the development in terms of dominant areas of activity and innovation, then you get a chronological pattern with a gradual expansion of the empirical domain. In what way? Well, quality-oriented semasiology, that's basically what's introduced in pre-structuralist semantics. The structure of polysemy, specifically as emanating from a historical change, but still the structure of polysemy. The structure of the lexicon, which is what onomasiology deals with. Cognitive semantics introducing prototypicality, and cognitive semantics introducing a number of novel forms of onomasiological structure, as we've seen. In this way, it's again a bit too simplistic, so let me nuance a little bit. Semasiology. Okay, that's clear enough. That's just to get started. But of course, neo-generativist semantics also introduces a lot of research on regular polysemy, polysemy that could be captured in a type of rule. Cognitive semantics, as we've seen, introduces things like conceptual metaphors and metonymies. So there is a bit of nuance to add to the overview. But importantly, as I tried to indicate, the theoretical tensions that I emphasized in the first part of the talk are, if you wish, a little bit attenuated. The fact that from a descriptive point of view, you see this nice growth in the scope of the kind of phenomena that you can look at in lexical semantics. And basically, all the traditions that, or at least the major traditions that I identified, contribute to this expansion of the field. Now, the third and final aspect of the evolution that I want to say something about is the methodological development of lexical semantics. But I'm going to do that in a fairly restricted way, in the sense that I'm only going to look at something that is currently playing a major role, namely the rise of corpus-based semantics. And the rise of corpus-based semantics, so the use of digital text corpora to do lexical semantic research, that's becoming extremely important at the moment. And why is that? Well, you might say that there is a double motivation behind that, in the sense that there is, at the same time, if you wish, a theoretical pull and a technological push. The theoretical pull is that we saw that, at least in cognitive semantics, you have this shift towards usage-oriented approaches to language. You go from a perspective that deals with the language as a system that precedes usage, to an approach where you look more carefully into how the system is actually being used and how the system changes under the influence of how it is being used. So this shift towards a usage-oriented perspective actually triggers the need for the documentation of actual language use. If you want to study language from a usage perspective, you need usage data. And obviously, the enormous amount of digitally available texts that we have at the moment can be seen as a documentation of spontaneous language use. So that also means that, on the other hand, there is this technological push, because why is that, or how did it come about that that material is available? Well, that's obviously the result of the digital revolution. So the digital revolution yields a wealth of, well, more or less readily available texts, and it also yields computational tools for accessing them. So there is an opportunity. So on the one hand, there is, if you wish, a demand, a theoretical demand, and on the other hand, there is a technological opportunity. And these two together have led to an enormous increase in corpus semantic research. And now, what I would want to do in this perspective is to give you a kind of brief, more or less systematic overview of different approaches that you can take in such a corpus semantic approach. When I say different approaches, I mean that from a non-technical point of view. I'm going to have a look at, well, not entirely non-technical, but not specifically technical. So there won't be any practical tips or whatever in what I'm going to say. What I want to focus on is the essential choices that you can make in a corpus semantic approach to lexical meaning. Essential choices that then also define different, well, perhaps I can call them different traditions of corpus semantic research. In order to do that, I need to take an intermediate step. I first have to point out that the dominant method in corpus semantics is what is known as distributional semantics. And distributional semantics is based on the idea that you can identify the meaning of a word in terms of the context that it appears in. So in a context, those are the co-occurring words that you find in a text. So if you read a text, what do? You understand the word and you, for instance, disambiguate a word. You identify the correct meaning by seeing by noticing, mostly unconsciously, but by noticing what other words in the text are available. That very general idea is known as the distributional hypothesis. It's very often identified by referring to a quote from John Rupert Firth: "You shall know a word by the company it keeps." So that's basically what ties together all forms of corpus semantic research. That could also mean, incidentally, that there are limits to corpus semantic research. That's something that should also be pointed out, because obviously when we are interpreting expressions, messages, texts, we may not only take into account what is in the text, we may also take into account a wider context, a lot of background knowledge that we have and that will not be explicitly available in the text. But okay, let's try to focus on what corpus semantics does. And then as a first step, or well, maybe that's already the second step by now, we have to see that such an approach, such a distributional approach to the identification of meaning in texts links up with two earlier traditions. One is the addition of pre-structuralist diachronic semantics. Why? Well, in actual practice, what you have to do when you do historical semantics is to read texts from an older period of the language. And how are you going to understand the texts from an older period of the language? Well, you do that by looking carefully at the text. What is the context in which a specific word occurs, and what does that tell me about the meaning? So a pre-structuralist tradition of diachronic semantics, that's something that I didn't mention earlier. This pre-structuralist tradition is also closely linked to the compilation of historical dictionaries of a language. And historical dictionaries and lexicography at large in the pre-digital era was basically about carefully reading texts. And carefully reading texts is basically doing distributional semantics, but in a non-computational way. So that's one first interesting link. The second link is that there is also a branch of structuralist semantics that I didn't talk about, and which basically looks at syntagmatic relations among words. So syntagmatic relations, think about that as the restrictions that you get and the tendencies that you get to bring together words. For instance, drive a car rather, versus ride a horse. Why drive a car and not drive a horse or ride a car? In some languages, that distinction is not made. So if you have that specific choice of drive versus ride in English, then that is a specific lexical relation. So that would be interesting for structuralist semantics. But it's a lexical relation that is syntagmatic, that has to do with the combination of words. And so terminologically, what we talk about is, in that case, we would talk about, for instance, a collocation. Collocation as a specific combination of words. So this branch of structuralist semantics, which I didn't mention in my initial introduction, in my initial overview of the traditions, is also one that links up with this distributional approach, because the distributional approach is also looking from this syntagmatic point of view, looking at co-occurrences. And if we then try to get a bit more systematic now that we see what a distributional approach in general implies and how it links up with earlier approaches, then I might point out that such a distributional approach basically consists of two steps. First, you want to identify relevant contextual features. What are the elements that your target, the word that you're interested in, typically occurs with? So you're going to identify co-occurring expressions. And then a second step is that you want to detect patterns in those co-occurring features. Typically, for instance, if a word has more than one meaning, then the patterns of co-occurrence that you find for one meaning should be different from the patterns of co-occurrences that you find for another meaning. And the field, if you wish, the methodological field of corpus semantics can now be structured if you take into account that each of these steps can be performed either manually or statistically. So you get four major approaches. You have identifying co-occurrences, detecting patterns. You can do that manually or statistically, manually or statistically. And the manual approach, well, that's philology, looking at older texts, diachronic semantics, lexicography in the pre-computational era. So there's a tradition there, but this obviously is the non-digital tradition. So that's not so interesting from the point of view that I want to illustrate here, which is the question, what different types of corpus-based, computational corpus-based approaches do we have? Now, an approach where you identify co-occurrences statistically and then manually interpret what you find, that's what is now mostly known as collocation analysis. So as an example, this is a tradition that basically started in a lexicographical context with John Sinclair. And what you would do is, precisely illustrating the point that I made a moment ago, the English bank is homonymous. It's homonymous between the meaning where you refer to a financial institution and the meaning where you refer to the side of a river. Now, in both cases, the collocations that the word bank occurs with will be different. So what you do in this approach is you take your corpus, you do a statistical analysis on the corpus to see what the words are that bank typically co-occurs with. And in one case, you will find items like cashier, deposit, financial, money, overdraft, pay, steal, rob, whatever. In another case, you will find examples like cave, codfish, float, headland, and so on. Then, of course, you also get different compounds, bank account versus sandbank, for instance. And of course, in this case, it's relatively easy to establish that this is one pattern and this is another. But so, to come back to this, in this approach, the statistical method is used to establish that in a large corpus, a word like bank occurs often with a word like cashier, but also often with a word like maybe float. But finding structure in those collocations is done manually. Okay. Now, another approach, and that's essentially what is known as a behavioral profile approach, is one in which you take the first step manually, but in which you then do a statistical analysis on the co-occurring elements. That's an approach that was pioneered around the year 2000, on the one hand by Stefan Gries, on the other hand also by people in my own team. So for instance, to give one example of the things that we've been doing, we've been analyzing the Dutch particle which is a presentative element, trying to get at the meaning of that word. You manually code your corpus instances of the word, of the particle, for relevant structural features. That would be, in this case, adjunct type, verbal specificity, and other elements. Other contextual features, the register of the text in which you find the word, and so on. And then you do a statistical analysis, like a regression analysis or a cluster analysis or a correspondence analysis, to determine the factors that lead to the presence or the absence of this presentational element. So that's an example, to go back, of what is now usually known as a behavioral profile approach. So to repeat, what you do is, in your corpus, you manually identify the elements that you think are important and that co-occur with your target. And then you do a statistical analysis to find patterns in those co-occurrences. And then a final approach is a vector space approach, in which you identify the co-occurrences and in which you detect the patterns in a statistical, or at least a computational way, in both cases. So there you combine a first step, finding co-occurrences, with a second step of finding a structure in those co-occurrences. If that works, if that can be done, then obviously you would have a major step forward, because one of the problems that you have at the moment is that, on the one hand, it's extremely interesting that you have all those corpus data, but then on the other hand, the amount of corpus data that you might possibly identify or possibly analyze is enormous. So any type of method, any type of technology that can help you to get a grip on that enormous amount of data will be helpful. So in this case, if you use a vector space approach, and if it is successful, then you can speed up the type of semantic analysis that you would want to do, and you would be able to deal with more data than if you were to do it with one of the other approaches, which is much more relying on manual information, or manual activity. Now, I'm definitely not saying that we can avoid manual steps in doing lexical semantics. I'm even quite convinced that that is definitely not the case. There has to be a manual approach, if only because all the data that you have need to be interpreted. But even so, it would be a major step forward if we can successfully develop this vector space approach beyond its current stage. So what you do, and to say a little bit more about that, so what you do in a semantic vector space approach, and I should mention that this is an approach that is becoming popular in linguistics, specifically in an implementation that comes from natural language. And that's approaches like word2vec and related approaches. One of the people doing a lot of research in that direction is Martin Hilbert. And so, as I mentioned, it combines the perspective of collocation analysis, more specifically by building a matrix with collocational strengths of targets words with regard to context words. And it combines that with features of the behavioral profile approach, in the sense that you, again, by means of statistical methods, try to identify patterns on the basis of similar distributions in that matrix that you build. I can't go into more technical detail at the moment. I might show some examples, or an example if there's an interest in that, but I think I'm now going to wrap up by simply saying that what we are currently doing in our research team, so in quantitative lexicology and variational linguistics teams, QLVL, in Leuven, at the University of Leuven, is precisely to develop tools to make the use of semantic vector methods of the type that I just introduced more transparent and more manipulable for linguists. What is the idea here? Well, if you rely on the tools that you get from computational linguistics, then it's often not so entirely clear precisely what is going on. So from a linguistic point of view, it would be interesting to have a number of tools that allow you to set the relevant parameters in the way you would like, and that also allow you to see, in a sense, behind the screen what is going on, what the results are of the analysis that you are getting. And one of those tools, for instance, would be tools that visualize the results of the vector approach in a neat way, and that allow you to explore the results that you get in that visualization. Now, that visualization often takes the form of a cloud of a set of points in graphical space, a set of points where each point is one instance that you found, one example that you found of a certain word. And then what you would like to see, if the vector space approach works well, is that the points with a similar meaning, or at least examples that are more or less illustrating the same context, are close together, right? Now, in the current state of the methods, that is not always the case. So one of the questions that we are trying to answer is, and it's a question that many people are trying to answer, how adequate are those vector space approaches actually for dealing with meaning in corpus data? And then on the other hand, how can we help linguists to deal with those methods? All of that goes under the name of nephological semantics. It's something I need to explain. Nephology is the study of the shape of clouds, yeah, right? Actual clouds like you would have in the sky. So if you have cumulus and cumulonimbus, that's nephology. So in this case, we are looking at clouds that represent clouds of tokens that represent corpus-based vector analysis of meanings. And we're looking at the shape of the clouds to see if they represent meaning in the way we would expect them to do. And this nephological semantics project, I do want to mention these people. It's a really marvelous team of young researchers that I'm working with. Do want to mention them by name: Chris Helen, Stefano De Pascale, Mariana Montes, Carlene Franco, and Weiwei Zhang. They are really doing great research, and I'm sure you will be hearing more of them in the future. Now, let me conclude. The development of lexical semantics over the past 150 years is characterized by underlying theoretical tensions between more usage-based approaches and more system-oriented approaches. At the same time, it's characterized by a steady cumulative expansion of the descriptive scope of the field, and it's also characterized by a highly promising recent enrichment of its methodological toolkit with computational corpus methods. So that's what I wanted to talk about. And I'm open to questions if there might be any.
Yes. Thank you very, very much, Professor. Thank you for this amazing talk. And thank you again to Abralin. Yes, we do have some questions here. Oh, I have one myself, but first, there's a question from Luana Amaral. There are actually two questions from her. The first one is, how can we grasp the semantics of a word in cognitive semantics? How to differentiate it from construction meaning is the first question.
Yes, well, my perspective would be that so no, let me perhaps put it differently. What I tried to say in the beginning of the talk was that there are some aspects of, or some insights into the structure of meaning that you can, in a sense, more easily get to, more easily achieve when you look at individual words. So all the phenomena that I introduced, onomasiological structures and so on, those are things that you can study in the lexical field. If you then move to constructions, and if you assume that a construction in the way in which it's used these days in construction grammar works like a lexical item, then of course you can use all, you can try to apply all the models that you've learned about in lexical research to construction grammar. And I think that I'll have to add something else in a moment, but one important point here is that I think that that is not sufficiently the case. For instance, I don't think that construction grammar at this point is sufficiently taking into account the onomasiological dimension of meaning structure and lexical structure. Well, lexical categorical structure, if you wish. So I think there's going to be quite a bit of inspiration in doing lexical research if you move to construction work. Another point is that once you, I'm almost tempted to say, once you extrapolate from the lexicon to the constructicon, as some people are nowadays calling it, then of course you're dealing with an extra problem. You're dealing with a problem, the problem, let's say, of compositionality, because within a construction, lexical meaning or lexical items will play a certain role and will combine sometimes with open slots, sometimes with very schematic abstract slots and a kind of template type of approach, will combine to create the meaning of the entire construction. So the additional thing that you want to have a look at from a semantic point of view when you're studying your constructions is the compositionality, the semantic compositionality of the construction, where precisely one of the major tenets of construction grammar is that there are some aspects of the meaning of a construction that are not compositional, that are not simply derived from the combination of the items. But there again, now this is something that I didn't talk about in the talk, but there again, I think you could get inspiration from existing work in lexical semantics and morphological semantics on compositionality. There's a lot of work on morphological meaning, the meaning of compounds as morphological entities, and basically the phenomena that you will get in syntactic compounding, which is in a sense what you get in constructions. A lot of those phenomena should in principle be roughly the same as the ones you would get in morphologically oriented studies of compounding. So in general, my point would be that the lexical semantics and the study of vocabulary and the meaning of vocabulary in a more traditional sense is going to be very useful if you are more interested in constructions than in lexical items, if you're more interested in the constructicon than in the lexicon.
Okay. Thank you very much. Once more. And yes, we have a second question by Luana Amaral again. And the question is, Professor, you didn't talk much about lexical decomposition, but it seems to be something common in main approaches to lexical semantics. And it also appears in syntactic theories. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I think I didn't talk a lot about it because I'm not. I've always had a bit of a problem with the way lexical decomposition. So let's say all types of componential approaches are applied in lexical semantics. And let me say that I'm talking about from experience. And my experience is that if you want to do that type of decompositional work, you very soon reach the limit of the approach or reach the come across certain difficulties. And the difficulty is always what is going to be the ultimate set of basic components that you're going to use in your decompositional framework. And I've always found it highly difficult, very difficult to identify such a set. In that sense, I'm not going to go into all the reasons, but for instance, if you take the natural semantic meta-language approach, so Anna Wierzbicka's approach, which I briefly refer to, that's an approach where you try to describe all types of meaning in all languages on the basis of a universal set of 60 basic components. But it's so restrictive if you do that, it's not only restrictive for the actual descriptions that you can do, but it's also very difficult to find a safe method to identify what those basic components would be. So from that point of view, if you take that perspective, I'm not really terribly in favor of such a compositional approach. So I'm not in, let me put it in this way, I'm going to nuance in a moment, but I'm not in favor of a compositional approach if it means that you assume that there is a basic set of stable components with which you can, like Lego building blocks, with which you can build and descriptively represent all types of meaning that you might be interested in. That's not the way to do it, I would say. On the other hand, I am absolutely convinced, that's also a method I've used a lot in previous research. I'm very much convinced that when you are describing meanings and when you are describing lexical structures and polysemic structures, it's obviously important to take an analytical approach to meaning, an analytical approach where you find a meaning in a certain, or you find a word in a certain context. If you want to describe how that word in that context, in that quotation, let's say, refers or relates to the way in which the word appears in another context, then you will have to break down the meaning of that word in that context and see what the features, what the characteristics are of that word. As a very simplistic example, coming back to the example I gave with the example I referred to with bank. If you do a manual analysis, and if you are trying to see what the difference is between one bank and the other, then you will break down the concept of bank in one case and in the other, and the features will be different. So that is like a componential analysis, but it's without the assumption that the components that you use, say in this case, one bank and the other bank, okay, what are the features that apply? One would be an institution, the other would be a natural phenomenon, one would be not just an institution, but an institution, a human institution, the other one is a natural thing, and so on. So you can list the features, and that is important. Analytically looking at meaning is very important, but it's roughly the same thing as defining. But as I was saying, assuming that the elements that you can break a meaning into would belong to a restricted set or a set that is even universal, that is something that is very, very difficult to apply in practice.
Okay. Thank you. Well, we have one more question, this time by Marcia Machado. Hello, Marcia. So the question is, could you talk more about the limits involved in identifying meaning in terms of context and also in terms of A, a perspective based on the researcher's limited experience of the world, and or in terms of B, an inclination to the social conventionality phase related to the linguistic repetition and creativity forces.
Yes.
Chantworth, what would you suggest in order to deal with it?
Could you repeat the A point, because I didn't get that?
The A is well, the limits of identifying meaning in terms of a perspective based on the researcher's limited experience of the world.
Yeah, okay. Yes, that's an important point. So let's say that a researcher is obviously, as the question suggests, is limited in his or her experience with the word. But that's of course precisely why you go to corpus data. You go to corpus data because you want to, simplistically, you want to get to know the applications of the words that you are not familiar with yourself. That's the general argument in favor of a not entirely introspective approach to meaning description. That is to say, that is an argument in favor of an empirical approach in which you first collect the data in the form of a corpus, for instance, and then analyze the data. And so, indeed, the limited background of the analyst, of the researcher, has methodological consequences, and a researcher will try to overcome his or her own limitations precisely by following a methodological path that is as empirical as possible. Then, and I think that brings me to the second point. If you do that, if you look at the corpus data that you find, then obviously what you would, or at least what you assume, is that you are tapping into the conventional usages of the word. And the conventional use, if you have enough data, then you will be able to see what the normal ways of using the word is. But at the same time, and so that is probably what in the question is referred to as social convention. And the conventional way of talking about meaning is most likely going to be the way of talking about meaning, of using words. The conventional way of using words is the usage of the words that is dominant, that is most frequent in the corpus data that you have. There is a little bit of a difficulty there because obviously that assumes that your corpus data are representative, that you have the right corpus. But the corpus is always, let's say, typical or representative for a certain group of speakers, of users of the language. And we should also not assume that all groups in the language precisely have the same knowledge of the language. So that brings you to this other concept that I didn't talk about, but that was mentioned in the introduction by Joko, the importance of a social perspective on language, a social perspective where you can see how language variation, maybe also, definitely also linguistic or semantic variation, is socially structured. Again, translating that in methodological terms, that means that if you do your corpus analysis, you have to have a clear idea, or at least you have to have a clear look at how background features, like the type of speakers represented in the corpus, the type of language users represented in the corpus, may lead to variation within the corpus. So there will be socially conventional usages in the corpus, but there's usually also social difference in a corpus. So a general methodological requirement in doing corpus research is to take into account the possibility of social structure and social variation in the corpus data that you have, which is something which is very often forgotten. People tend to look at corpus data as something homogeneous, as a homogeneous representation of the conventional language, for instance. But that usually underestimates the variation that you have in the corpus. So if you do corpus research, always keep in mind that it's necessary, it's required to see if there is any specific variation in the corpus. So to zoom in then on the question of social convention, what you find in the corpus in the most frequent usages in the corpus is indeed something that has to do with the socially conventional way of using words, but there are at least two ways in which you can depart from that. One is, like I just said, that you will have a socially structured variation, or potentially have socially structured variation. So different conventions, if you wish. And then also, even within the conventions, there's a lot of flexibility. So it's not the case that languages and the meaning of linguistic expressions is firmly fixed. Even in totally conventional usage of words, you will use the words in ways that are not entirely uniform, where there are slight modulations, variations on the meaning that are expressed. So in general, to bring together the A point and the B point in the question, the aim point, limited experience of the researcher, that needs to be transcended by looking at a wide array of corpus data or other empirical data. But then that will allow you to tap into the social conventions, but the social conventions will never be stable and fixed. There will be variation within a social group. That's what cognitive sociolinguistics would want to look at. And there's also going to be semantic flexibility even within the more conventional ways of using a word.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again. I think I have one question myself, and all the previous questions have been very general and broad. I think mine is a very specific one. Just out of curiosity, I guess, you have mentioned earlier in your talk a minor branch of structuralist semantics that focuses on syntagmatic relations. And then related this to collocations and concurrency.
Yes.
And then my question would be, would that be extrapolation? Would that be fair to assume that this kind of minor approach represents some sort of move away, at least slightly, from the system-oriented approach of structuralist linguistics and semantics as a whole? As opposed to a user-oriented approach.
Yes, that's actually what you see happening in the historical evolution of that approach. So the first, I didn't go into that very explicitly, but in the first introduction, if you wish, of such a syntagmatic structuralist approach also dates from the 1930s, and it's fully integrated at that point. Well, fully integrated. It is part at that point of this system-oriented approach. Then, after the Second World War, the same rather more abstract idea about syntagmatic relations is turned into a methodological perspective. That's what you get in this quotation by Firth, right? You shall know a word by the company it keeps. That's basically saying, if you, and Firth was a structuralist linguist, I should mention that. If you take this syntagmatic perspective, then in a sense, you can use it as a methodological principle. But in Firth's case, that's still essentially a manual approach, and it's a manual approach, as I explained, that is not different from what lexical semanticians have been doing all the time when they were dealing with texts. But then, very importantly, in the 1970s, John Sinclair took inspiration from that idea of Firth to start compiling his Go-Build dictionary of contemporary English. And in the Go-Build dictionary, this was one of the first dictionaries that was actually based on a computationally analyzed corpus. And so the computational analysis basically took the Firthian inspiration, translated that into a statistical approach for identifying collocational patterns and collocations in the corpus, and then used those collocations to enrich the dictionary and to identify polysemy in the dictionary or in the items and so on. And from there, then you get another step in the evolution. From there, and that's basically something that is, I think, a bit hidden if people look at computational linguistics at this point. That idea, ultimately lexicographical corpus analysis, was developed, or was, no, let me put it differently, was a major impetus for the development of computational linguistics as we know it now, because in what you get in computational linguistics now is a whole battery of statistical techniques for analyzing corpus data. But that was very much developed through the inspiration derived from what John Sinclair did on the Go-Build dictionary. And so what you can see now is that through this development in computational linguistics, and to some extent also directly relating to the linguistic work done by Sinclair, but perhaps I think more specifically through the computational line, it's now being introduced in cognitive semantic approaches. So there's indeed, and that's precisely also what you rightly refer to. There is this branch of structuralist semantics that, through a number of steps, and specifically through its switch from a purely descriptive approach to a methodological principle, that brings the system-oriented inspiration of structuralist semantics closer to the usage-based approach that you find in cognitive semantics and so on. I'm not sure if that completely answers the question, but
it definitely goes way beyond the question. Thank you very much. Well, we are running out of time, unfortunately. We did have more questions coming in. I'm so sorry for those who have asked questions. Unfortunately, we don't have more time, and unfortunately, we cannot discuss the other questions over a cup of coffee during the coffee break.
Unfortunately,
on ourselves and on our own places. But it was a pleasure, really. Thank you very much for being here. Being there and being here
yes.
with us, Professor. Thank you very much, Abraham. I think this breathtaking program of talks is amazing. I really like it and enjoying it, and I'm sure everyone is. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, thank you for listening to me.
And please, you all keeping coming back to the other talks. As I said, they have this breathtaking program of talks till the end of July, I guess. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you again, Professor Geeraerts. Bye.
Bye.